In a mountainous region of Norway, isolated by the harsh winter, there was an abandoned house known as the House of Eternal Silence. It was said that, during the coldest nights, one could hear footsteps echoing inside the house, even though it was completely empty. In 1978, a group of 3 friends decided to explore the location. During their visit, they noticed that the temperature inside the house was even colder than outside. One of them, Eric, began to report strange sensations, as if he were floating. He entered a trance-like state and described a man with empty eyes standing in front of an extinguished fireplace. When Eric came to, he claimed to have seen an entire family trapped there, eternally reliving their last night of life. He told them that during a violent snowstorm, the father had gone mad, killed his wife and children, and then took his own life. Since that night, anyone who entered the house risked becoming part of that dark cycle. Eric and his friends fled, but he was never the same, suffering from constant nightmares until the end of his life. On that cold December night, Eric and his 2 friends, Ingrid and Lars, were sitting by the fireplace in the cabin where they were spending their holiday. The conversation, filled with horror stories and nervous laughter, inevitably turned to the House of Eternal Silence, a local legend that intrigued all 3. "We should go there," Lars suggested, a spark of challenge in his eyes. Ingrid hesitated, but curiosity won. With flashlights in hand and hearts racing, they set off for the house. As they crossed the threshold, an intense cold enveloped them. The walls seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only the echo of their footsteps. Shadows danced to the rhythm of the trembling flashlights. "Do you feel that?" Eric asked, his voice faltering. He touched the icy wall and immediately recoiled, feeling an almost alive energy pulsating there. The friends explored every corner of the house, noticing old objects covered in dust and furniture marks on the floor, as if things had been dragged recently. Ingrid found a portrait of a family in a golden frame, but the father's face was scratched with deep gouges. While exploring the main room, Eric suddenly stopped, his eyes fixed on the extinguished fireplace. He dropped to his knees, muttering incoherent words. "He's here, watching." Ingrid and Lars tried to lift him, but Eric seemed rooted to the floor. His eyes rolled back and he began to describe what he saw. A family frozen in time with the father holding a bloody axe. The vision was so clear that Eric could smell the blood mixed with the scent of burnt wood. He described the moment when the father, consumed by supernatural rage, walked down the hall toward the children's room. Every word made Ingrid and Lars tremble. Suddenly, whispers began to fill the air. It was as if the walls were speaking, repeating names and incomplete phrases. Ingrid screamed as she felt something touch her shoulder, but there was nothing there. Lars gripped the flashlight so tightly that his hands shook. "We need to get out of here," he shouted, but their steps seemed to take them deeper into the house. Eric finally woke, panting. "They're trapped, reliving the endless horror," he said in a hoarse voice. A sense of urgency overwhelmed them, and the friends ran to leave the house. But the door, which had been opened before, now refused to budge. Shadows seemed to draw closer, and cold whispers filled the air. Only when they screamed in unison did the door open, releasing them into the freezing night. Back at the cabin, Eric was catatonic. For days he didn't say a word. When he finally came to, he reported that his soul had been pulled into a world where time didn't exist, and he relived every moment of the massacre that had occurred in the house. He warned that anyone who dared enter again would not leave. Ingrid and Lars were also affected. Ingrid began seeing shadows in her house, while Lars heard footsteps and knocks on the door in the early hours of the morning. They tried to warn others, but few believed. Months later, Eric decided to return to the House of Eternal Silence, convinced he needed to break the cycle. He brought a recorder, saying he would leave a final message. Ingrid and Lars refused to accompany him, but deep down, they knew he wouldn't survive. Days later, they found the recorder in front of the house's door. The last recording was of Eric describing his entry into the house. His voice trembled, but he seemed determined. "I'm going to free them. God have mercy on me." The tape ends with a deafening sound and Eric screams. Since then, no one has dared to cross the threshold of the House of Eternal Silence. The legend remains, haunting those who dare speak of it. At the far north of Siberia, there was an abandoned train station called the Dark Station. During World War II, reports of disappearances and sightings of spectral figures began to emerge. The legend said that on nights of extreme winter, one could hear the sound of a ghost train that never arrived but whose passengers were forever trapped between worlds. In 1985, a group of Russian students fascinated by the paranormal decided to investigate the station. They didn't know what awaited them, an unforgettable nightmare. The students, Dmitry, Ivan, and Alina, were gathered in a cafe in the small village of Krasnoyarsk. During a conversation, Dmitry mentioned the Dark Station and the rumors that every decade it called new passengers. Alina, curious and sensitive, felt a chill upon hearing the story. After much discussion, they decided to travel to the station. The promise of unraveling the mystery was irresistible, and an inexplicable sensation seemed to guide them. The night before the trip, Alina had a disturbing dream. A fog-covered train, filled with faceless people watching her while whispering her name. When they arrived at the station, a fierce snowstorm greeted them. The platform was partially covered with ice, and the rusty structure seemed ready to collapse. Strangely, there was absolute silence, as if the place had been torn from the real world. As they explored the platform, Alina began to feel a strange energy. "Something is watching us," she whispered. Dmitry found an old train ticket on the floor, with words in a language none of them recognized. Ivan mocked Alina's concerns, but even he felt a presence when they entered the main station. Inside the station, they came across an empty hall. However, when stepping on a certain spot, Dmitry suddenly collapsed. When he woke, he described a terrifying experience. He saw the station filled with ghostly passengers, all standing and staring at the tracks. Dmitry claimed he had experienced something like an involuntary astral projection, feeling as if his body was detached but still connected to that place in a visceral way. His friends began to fear that the legends were more real than they had imagined. At dusk, a distant sound began echoing along the tracks, the noise of an approaching train. However, there was no light on the horizon. Suddenly, the station began to vibrate slightly, and a cold wind swept through the hall. Alina was pulled into a deep trance, her consciousness transported to a dark train car. She saw motionless passengers like statues, whose mouths moved in silent unison. Then a guttural voice broke the silence. "You've come too far. Now you are part of the enigma." Back in the station hall, Dmitry and Ivan tried to wake Alina, who murmured incomprehensible words. The lights began to flicker, and shadows on the walls seemed to take form. A strange, glowing symbol appeared on the floor, and Dmitry realized that the ticket they had found earlier was now burning in his hands. Ivan screamed as he saw shadows moving toward him, trying to engulf him. Alina suddenly woke up and shouted, "Follow the symbol, or we'll be trapped here forever." Following the symbol, the three of them ran to the platform. The ghost train's sound intensified, and the tracks began to glow with a sinister light. A spectral car appeared momentarily, and Alina realized that the only way to escape was to cross the portal it created. With hearts racing, the friends leaped through the light at the last moment. Behind them, the station disappeared in an explosion of shadows and silence. Back in the village, the students were shaken but relieved to have survived. However, each of them began suffering side effects. Dmitry had recurring dreams where he was a passenger on the train. Ivan saw shadow reflections on shiny surfaces, and Alina started hearing whispers whenever she was alone. They tried to warn others about the dark station, but no one believed. Years later, Dmitry mysteriously disappeared during a winter trip, and rumors began circulating that he had returned to the station. The legend continued, now with a warning. Never follow the sound of a train in winter unless you're ready to board and never return. This account comes from an incident that occurred in the 1950s in a small town in northern Canada, where the winters are relentless and the nights long and dark. Robert had always been a solitary man, accustomed to living in the frozen vastness of northern Canada. The small town where he lived seemed forgotten, surrounded by dense forests and covered with a layer of snow that never seemed to melt. When winter arrived, the nights were long and dark, with biting winds howling through the cracks in the houses. One winter, his family traveled to a neighboring town, leaving him alone in the old wooden house, an isolated structure far from any neighbors. The warmth of the fireplace was Robert's only companion that night. The sound of the crackling wood seemed like the only thing keeping him grounded in the physical world. But, like a growing shadow, a strange feeling began to take over him. Something was wrong. He couldn't identify what it was, but the pressure in the air was palpable. He felt watched, yet there was no one. He glanced around at the corners of the house, trying to convince himself it was just loneliness messing with his mind. With each crack of the wood, he imagined someone or something approaching. He forced himself to ignore it. But as the night progressed, the atmosphere felt heavier. He didn't know it, but that night would mark the beginning of a nightmare he could never forget. When Robert looked again down the dark hallway, an odd reflection formed in the corner of his peripheral vision. He stood up, trying to see better. It was a figure, a shadow floating ahead of him without clear edges, as if it were distorting and dematerializing. His heart raced. That presence, that formless figure, seemed to feed off his fear, as if it knew he was watching. The figure had no face, but Robert knew instinctively that it was staring at him. A chill ran down his spine, and a feeling of dread overwhelmed him. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as if an invisible force had pinned him in place, as if he were a puppet, and the entity was the puppeteer. The temperature in the house plummeted almost instantly. The warmth from the fireplace vanished, and the air became icy. His lungs began to feel heavy, as if he were breathing through ice. He didn't know if the presence was getting closer or if it was just there, waiting, but one thing he knew for sure. This was not from this world. Then something even stranger happened. Robert began to feel a sense of detachment, as though he were disconnecting from his own body. His vision blurred, and in the blink of an eye, he was floating. He no longer felt the weight of his body, and his mind, freed from the pressure of flesh, felt almost light, almost ethereal. He observed his own body, sitting in the armchair, paralyzed with fear. His spirit, or whatever it was moving away from physical reality. Robert didn't understand how this was happening, but he was aware that it was an astral projection. However, instead of a sense of freedom or peace, he felt as though he was being pulled into something far darker. Outside the house, the blizzard seemed fiercer. The night's darkness seemed to consume everything, making the landscape even more unrecognizable. He tried to move, but his astral body was completely at the mercy of the unknown force pulling him back to the house, to that dark being. While floating, Robert found himself far from his house. He looked around and saw the town covered in a thick blanket of snow, but everything was distorted. The houses, the trees, even the town lights were wrong, as if an altered, grotesque version of reality was being projected before him. It was as though he had crossed a threshold between worlds, a space where normality no longer existed. And then, he saw it, the entity. It was in front of him, floating in the same nebulous form, but now it seemed more solid, more real. Robert felt his astral body being drawn toward it, as if an invisible connection bound him to the being. His mind screamed to return, to go back to his body, but it was as though he was being dragged toward a dark fate. The presence of the entity was suffocating. It approached slowly, floating in the air, and Robert felt an overwhelming pressure, as if the air around him was becoming dense, heavy, unbearable. He could no longer move. He could no longer escape. Suddenly, a feeling of panic overtook Robert. He felt as though he was being sucked back into his body, but the experience wasn't peaceful. It was as if something was forcing him, dragging him back into the physical world against his will. He tried to scream, but his voice was frozen, as if he had no control over anything. He abruptly awoke, gasping for breath, sweat dripping from his forehead. His eyes were wide open, and he looked around, trying to understand what had happened. He still felt the presence of the entity, as if it were watching his every move. The air was cold, and his breath came out in clouds, as though he were still in the astral world. In the following days, Robert could no longer shake the feeling that something was watching him. Every shadow seemed to come to life, every whisper of the wind sounded like a distant, threatening voice. He began avoiding the house at night, fearing that the entity would return. The winter nights, once just solitary, now became terrifying. Robert knew what he had experienced that night was not just a nightmare. Something had attached itself to him, something that shouldn't be there. He began to fear that his own mind was being manipulated, that the entity was trying to infiltrate his reality, as if it wanted to drag him back into the world he had escaped. The next night, Robert could no longer ignore what was happening. He was back in his armchair, the fire still burning, but the cold persisted stronger than ever. And then he saw it. The entity, clearer than ever, appeared before him. There was no longer any doubt. It was there, waiting. And this time, Robert would not be able to escape. He felt his mind unravel, as if being pulled back into the abyss. But this time, he was not alone. Something was with him, something from another world leading him back into eternal darkness. Imagine yourself on a cold, moonless night, with the wind cutting like a blade and the darkness of winter taking over everything around you. The cold is so intense that you can barely feel your fingers, but at the same time, there is something even colder, a presence, a feeling that you are no longer alone. It's December of 1817 in the heart of Tennessee. The Bell family, consisting of patriarch John Bell, his wife Lucy, and their children, live on a secluded farm, far from the bustle of the town. The scene is one of total isolation, where the only company is the wind howling through the trees and the unsettling silence of the night. The first strange manifestation happens without warning in a subtle manner, but it is unsettling enough to leave an uncomfortable feeling. One winter morning, John Bell hears a peculiar sound, a strange noise, as if something is knocking on the walls of the house. At first he thinks it's just the wind, but the sound repeats night after night, growing louder and more audible, as if something or someone is trying to communicate. As the days pass, the sounds become more intense and less explainable. On one cold night, while the Bell family is gathered around the fireplace, a disturbing noise comes from within the walls. It wasn't just knocking, but something that was dragging, something that passed beneath the floor, scratching as if trying to get out from some deep place. The feeling of unease is palpable. The air feels heavy, as if it is charged with something malevolent, something invisible. And then, the entity reveals itself, not in a visible form, but through a voice. A guttural, muffled, and distorted voice, coming from some dark and deep place in the house. The voice was not human. It was like a chilling whisper, but it filled the space with an overwhelming pressure, something that made the heart race and the blood freeze in the veins. The first to be touched by this presence was Betsy Bell, the youngest daughter of John and Lucy. She began to report experiences of terrifying invisible touches, hands pulling her hair and scratching her through the night. Every time she tried to scream or ask for help, the hands would release her, but the cold she felt on her body remained, as if something invisible had left a frozen mark on her skin. As the weeks went by, the attacks became more brutal. Betsy reported that while she was sleeping, she would feel something crawling over her bed, even suffocating her, as if someone were lying on top of her. In moments of desperation, she would run to her mother's arms, but the terror never disappeared. There was no human being behind these actions, only an invisible, cruel, and relentless force. And it wasn't just Betsy. The presence seemed to follow all the family members. John Bell, the patriarch, began to suffer in ways no man should. He spent sleepless nights, hearing whispers around him. The witch's voice didn't speak directly to him, but it mocked him, telling him things about his life, about his death. She seemed to know his deepest secrets, his greatest fears. Many nights he found himself awake, eyes wide open, with an intense cold spreading through his body, as if something was watching him closely. The physical pain he felt, with inexplicable aches in his joints and chest, started to increase, and the entity seemed to feed on his suffering. Panic overtook the house. The entire Bell family was terrified, but the worst was yet to come. The spirit, or whatever it was, didn't just haunt them, but attacked with increasing force. Objects began to move on their own. Chairs were dragged across the floor. Glasses were broken inexplicably. In the silence of the night, the sounds of footsteps could be heard through the hallway, followed by a low, mocking laugh. The tension in the house grew every night. The presence became bolder, more audible. It started to speak to the family, but its words were filled with disdain and malice. The spirit identified itself as Kate Batts, a woman who had been a neighbor of the Bell family and who had died under mysterious circumstances. According to the spirit, Kate was seeking revenge. She had sworn to make the Bell family's life a living hell, and she would fulfill her promise without mercy. The Bell family was completely at the mercy of the entity. Neighbors and other townspeople started coming to the house to witness the phenomena. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving through the windows, while others reported hearing Kate Batts's voice in their own ears, whispering secrets and lies. The winter of 1821 arrived, and the psychological pressure on the Bell family became unbearable. John Bell, who had already been weakened by illness and the constant attacks of the entity, began to lose strength. He was pale, nearly unrecognizable, and his health deteriorated each day. The witch, in her most cruel manifestations, made a grim prediction. John Bell will die soon, and his death will be my victory. On one cold night, John Bell did not wake up. His eyes were wide open, his expression unsettling. Where he had been lying, the mattress was marked with a viscous, dark substance as black as death, and the doctors who examined him were baffled, unable to identify what had caused his death. The entity had fulfilled its promise. After John Bell's death, the attacks diminished, but the house was never the same. The witch's presence seemed to still linger over the property, and the manifestations continued, though in a less aggressive manner. The legend of the Bell House, also known as the Bell Witch Case, remains to this day one of the most terrifying and inexplicable paranormal accounts in U.S. history. Many believe that Kate Batts's entity has never stopped haunting the area, and that the Bell House still holds the echoes of her vengeance.